he continues to work tirelessly to improve his masterpiece. Yeah, I'll see myself out. The Great Gatsby was published in 1925 and written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. He based a majority of the characters off of people in his life, so we know the story is going to be interesting. The story itself takes place in the year 1922 in New York City. I read this book in my junior year of high school, and reading it a second time, I still have a hard time understanding what the heck is going on. So, as usual, I'm going to briefly summarize what the book is about and then make a few analyses. Now, some of the analyses I'm going to look at may not be what the teacher will ask you to look for, but if you need a paper idea, feel free to use some of these analyses. Now, I want to try to fit this all in one slide because there's so many tiny details to the overall story that I'd like you to interpret yourselves, so I'll just give you the base. The story is told from the first-person perspective of Nick Carraway, who is renting a place next door to the giant mansion of Jay Gatsby where everyone goes to party. One day, Nick meets up with his distant cousin Daisy, her husband Tom, and her childhood friend Jordan Baker. While Nick is hanging out with Jordan, she mentions that Tom has a mistress that he speaks with over the phone. Also that evening, Nick sees Gatsby staring at a green light across the bay. Some days later, Tom wants Nick to meet his mistress, Myrtle. Then, they all go to party with some other people at an apartment that Tom rents for himself and Myrtle. Some more days later, Nick receives a formal invitation from Gatsby to go to one of his parties. At the party, full of many people, Nick runs into Jordan and later Gatsby. Gatsby tries to get to know Nick, but then later tells him that he asked Jordan to tell Nick something important. Why he couldn't do it himself is beyond me. So, the next day, Jordan tells Nick that she met Gatsby 5 years ago and that he and Daisy were a thing, but since World War I was going on, Gatsby was deployed. Daisy reluctantly married Tom while Gatsby was away. Well, apparently, Gatsby is now of the belief that since he's got all this money and a spiffy new mansion, Daisy will surely leave Tom and come back to him. So, Nick arranges for Daisy and Gatsby to meet up, and the two start an affair. Well, Tom eventually discovers the affair and is not pleased about it. He and Gatsby argue about it, and Gatsby is so very convinced that Daisy never loved Tom and will leave him so they can live happily ever after. That is not true. Daisy can't declare that she never loved Tom because she still loves him and loves Gatsby too. Tom insists that Gatsby take Daisy home since he knows that Daisy won't leave him. Well, while Daisy was driving the car, she hits and instantly kills Myrtle, who was trying to run away from her husband, George, who found out about her affair. He doesn't know the affair was with Tom, but he believes that the person who hit her must have been her lover. Tom ends up telling George about Gatsby and that he was the owner of the car. Sometime during all this, Nick tells Gatsby to flee to avoid prosecution, but Gatsby would rather stay since he still believes that Daisy will come back to him. Well, the next morning, George arrives at Gatsby's house with a gun and kills him and himself. The only two people at Gatsby's funeral are his father, Henry Gatz, and Nick. Nick no longer enjoys living in New York and plans to move back to the Midwest. He actually runs into Tom at some point where he admits telling George that the car that killed Myrtle was Gatsby's. The book ends with Nick looking across the bay at the same green light that Gatsby was looking at. His particular light was located near Daisy's house. There is a lot to analyze here, symbolism-wise. There's also a lot of irony. I'm sure you could pick out a few of those ironic moments as I was summarizing the story. Alright, I'll give you a couple of symbols. One, the color white usually represents purity, and Daisy and Jordan are frequently seen wearing white. Now, since a few critical moments in the story take place in the summer when it's hot, and the color white doesn't absorb a lot of heat, that could probably be the author trying to make the environment more realistic. Or the author is trying to tell us something, who knows. Also, rain. You see this in movies all the time. Rain is meant to represent sadness or to raise the drama in a specific moment. That is why a lot of sad or intense moments happen in a storm. It rains at the very end of the book during Gatsby's funeral. Alright now. This is the most interesting thing I want to point out. This story isn't about Nick. It's about Gatsby. Nick is simply telling us what he knows about Gatsby and what he's seeing throughout this part of Gatsby's life. Now, granted, the story is in first person, which doesn't make the narrator super reliable since he's only telling us what he's seeing and what he assumes is going on. There's actually a lot that Nick doesn't tell us that we're left to assume on our own. Overall, the book is well written, however, it's very difficult to understand and grasp. And I'm sure this is intentional, but it feels like we're just watching this all play out instead of experiencing the story itself. Now, that can work in certain cases, but I don't know about this one. The Great Gatsby also had a couple of movie adaptations, been adapted into a stage play, and has been referenced in video games. Also, the story is in the public domain now. Do with that information what you will. I'd recommend this story for ages 16 and up for the reasons I mentioned before, with the language being difficult to understand. It's also hard to attach to any of the characters since they're not the best. But hey, schools will likely continue to teach this book for years, so we might as well get to know the book as well as we can to prepare. Also, there's a lot of adult situations within the book, so another reason why it's 16 and up. The book is also interesting for writing techniques and how to write about a character from the perspective of a separate narrator. Or you could just write it in the third person, but hey, that was my thoughts on The Great Gatsby. I hope this review was helpful to you in your studies. I know this review is pretty short, but I'd really encourage you to find your own interpretation of the events in this book. Happy reading, everyone!